几撮袂哩，会晕会戆，是我头爸爸仔，啊，佫有全身的起疹哦，咱就赶紧叫厝的人带来去互医生看啦。我是陈小芳，请你甲我共款，手闭起来，来去注疫苗，提升保护力。
So it's just very much baffling still, I think, for everyone here. Incredulous, just simply cannot believe that this has happened.
What is your impression, Steph, as far as the work of Palestinian journalists in the region and how differently or otherwise they're treated by the security forces?
Well, I think it's safe to say that there's no immunity, if you will, as a Palestinian journalist. Most Palestinian journalists who cover these stories day in, day out will wear press vests, will wear helmet, clearly marked press. A lot of these journalists are well known to the Israeli forces, particularly when it's in an area where they operate a lot. There is a knowledge, and also they're always clearly marked and usually staying in the same area altogether, covering, the stories. So it's incredibly difficult because A, there's no accountability. B, they get actively targeted. I've seen it firsthand, whether it's, with tear gas or stun grenades or skunk water, which is an extremely foul-smelling water that stays on you for days. It's very difficult to get off. All these different methods. So there is no way to be able to cover something here and go, oh, okay, we've got press and we're safe. And particularly Palestinian journalists, as you heard there from Nida also, how difficult it is to operate and to document. It's not all the time, but definitely it is, when things like this happen, there is also it's not even the expectation, it's the knowledge that there will be no accountability. I think because this is so high profile, because Shireen is, very well known, working for Al Jazeera, which is a station, owned by Qatar. Qatar and Israel, have relations when it comes to, dealing with Hamas, dealing in Gaza. This is a diplomatic incident at this point. So we will be hearing more information about what exactly happened. The Qataris will be expecting some kind of answer, as we have heard a very strong statement issued there by the government, also of course by Al Jazeera, and we've now also heard from the Israeli Foreign Ministry saying it's offered a joint pathological investigation and that it will be looked into. So answers will be demanded. I think, when you're talking to me about hierarchy, you're now also talking about a very prominent journalist of a major network owned by, a country that it has relations with Israel in somewhat extent in terms of how it manages situations here on the ground, particularly when it comes to Hamas and Gaza. But you also have this sometimes happening to journalists who have very little support, who might be freelancers, who might be working for a small Palestinian publication, where you will not be having this outcry, where you and I will not be talking about it live for hours on end, because they're not supported by such a major channel and a powerful country that has diplomatic consequences. So I think this is also important to highlight. Other Palestinian journalists with less of that kind of a backing face this all the time, and they've been killed too in the past, and they've been maimed too in the past. They've been killed in Gaza during border protests by sniper fire. And at some point, they become part of the narrative of simply a number, not this high profile as we are discussing now. So this is the reality, and I think it is important to highlight that, and they will tell you that it's not changing and it's not going to change, and there is no accountability when these things kinds of happen. This situation, because it is so much more high profile, may have more investigation, if you will, than when it has happened in the past to Palestinian journalists working for a local paper or a local channel.
All right, Steph, leave it there for the moment. Thanks very much indeed, Steph Decker reporting there. Well, another journalist was injured at the scene, but is in a stable condition, and he was asked about what took place while in hospital.
We were going to film the Israeli army operation, and suddenly they shot us without asking us to leave or stop filming. The first bullet hit me, and the second bullet hit Shireen. They killed her in cold blood because they are killers and specialize in killing only Palestinian people.
So they claimed that some Palestinian militants were there.
We had no resistance, and there was no Palestinian military resistance at all at the scene.
All right, let's speak to Nida Ibrahim, who's live for us in Ramallah in the occupied West Bank, speaking to us from the bureau there. Nida, Shireen was an experienced veteran journalist. She was a colleague of yours. She was very well respected. She was a friend to you all. It must be devastating for the whole team there.
We're still in shock. We haven't absorbed the loss yet. We keep telling ourselves, is it real? Did we really lose her? Is she not going to come back? Keep looking at pictures, keep getting phone calls from people whom she reported on their stories, prisoners, their wives, their families. She's been known to focus on the human side of the story, to spend time with people, to understand what has happened to them, and to be able to report on their stories. So we're getting all these phone calls that are probably leading us to believe or absorb that we really lost her. There is a lot of sadness here. There's a lot of mixed feelings, anger, shock, sadness, surprise. I asked one of her producers and friends, Wissam, I said, how do you feel? He goes, I'm numb. I don't feel anything. So it's hard to put those feelings in words because it just happened. We're still processing. But one thing we know for sure is that Shireen would want us to carry on our jobs, to report on the story, to keep on going, even if it's very difficult. We've been here at Al Jazeera Bureau receiving more and more journalists. They're coming to pay their condolences. They're shocked. But many of them knew her personally, knew how professional she was, how modest she was. Just people started pouring in to the Bureau. And we've been seeing them looking at pictures of her last moments when the gunshots continued, even though she has been injured and Palestinians were trying to take her, journalists were trying to pull her from the scene. We don't know if she had been carried to the hospital earlier, that we wouldn't have lost her. It was a severe injury, but there are so many questions. And I'm standing here in her office. This is where she used to sit and work. She's an experienced journalist who not only was a teacher to students in Birzeit University, but she also was a student as well. She recently got a diploma from Birzeit University in new media. She was also, when we were in Jenin in the past few weeks, she was showing us how she was learning Hebrew. She wanted to know more about what the Israeli media has been saying. So she's someone who is, as much as professional she is, seasoned, with experience, but she was still eager to learn more, to know more, and to tell the world the story.
Nida, we heard a couple of minutes ago from Al-Samudi, who was another journalist who was injured at the scene, and he was telling us about the circumstances of what happened as far as he could recall. What more have you managed to glean, first of all, about what the team were doing and then what happened at the time?
The team has been sleeping in Jenin as part of their continuous coverage to the Israeli raids that have been intensifying over the past few weeks. We've also heard the Israeli army say that they're going to carry out a campaign there. So people were the team was already there gearing up for the coverage. And according to one of our colleagues, our producer Rania, she saw the last email that Shireen sent was at 6 a.m. in the morning, 6:15 to be exact. She sent an email to the teams here in Ramallah and in Doha saying, there is an Israeli raid to Jenin, I'm gonna go and cover it. And this is the last we've heard from her. So it's hard for us to know what happened, the circumstances. As you mentioned, Ali was there with them. He probably was in a better position to advise what has been happening. But the feeling amongst the journalists here is that she was targeted. Journalists are targeted for telling the truth, and this is not the first time when Palestinian journalists get shot by the Israeli forces. So there's a feeling here that because these journalists are telling the truth, are conveying the story, this is the tragic ending that could be waiting for them.
Indeed. Targeted for telling the truth. Anita, we'll leave it there for the moment. Thank you. Well, let's take that point on. The media organization Reporters Without Borders says that Palestinian journalists experience major difficulties doing their jobs while Israeli media enjoy real freedoms. It says there have been several surges of violence against Palestinian journalists in recent years. It includes Israel's military offensive in the Gaza Strip in May last year. Others have been targeted during tensions linked to the month of Ramadan and the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound. The organisation says at least 144 Palestinian journalists have been at the receiving end of live rounds, rubber bullets, stun grenades or tear gas fired by Israeli soldiers or police. That's during the past 4 years of the protest known as the Great March of Return in the Gaza Strip, the occupied West Bank and East Jerusalem. So let's explore this further. We can speak to Omar Shakir, who's Israel and Palestine Director for Human Rights Watch. He's in Jordan's capital of Oman. Mr. Shakir, first of all, what's your reaction to this latest news?
Absolutely horrifying to hear the news this morning. My condolences go out to Al Jazeera, its reporters, Shireen's family and friends and colleagues. It's the last thing any of us want to hear when a journalist is killed doing their job. And I think, as you just heard from Nida, she was trying to tell the story of what's taking place. And I think what's taking place in Jenin right now is exactly why we need journalists like Shireen so badly. There have been an uptick in killings of Palestinians, of violence across Israel and Palestine in recent weeks. That story, whenever there are reports of killings, so often isn't told. And Shireen woke up in the early morning to go tell that story and was killed while doing that. And I think it's absolutely horrific. It's, of course, not a one-off event. We know that Israeli forces systematically have used excessive force. You just mentioned the Gaza March of Return, and I think that's a great place to start. The UN Commission of Inquiry investigated those events and documented that Israeli forces shot at journalists, knowing who they were. So this is an event that needs to be understood in the context of this systematic practice and the killings of many other Palestinian journalists. So Human Rights Watch is still investigating the specifics of what took place. You've heard the eyewitness testimonies of other Palestinians who have been there, who talked about being in close proximity to Israeli forces, there being no Palestinian resistance in the area. But I think it's important to understand this in the context of the systematic practice of excessive force by Israeli forces.
So now investigations should and will be carried out to a greater or lesser extent. How confident are you about that process?
Israeli investigations are a whitewash mechanism. That is the assessment that's been reached by human rights organizations, including Israel's premier human rights organization, B'Tselem. Human Rights Watch has a similar diagnosis. Israeli forces regularly, when news of their crimes are reported, say they'll investigate. Those are routinely leading to a whitewashing mechanism, no accountability. These kinds of killings highlight the necessity of the International Criminal Court moving forward, with its formal probe into serious crimes committed in Palestine, because the reality is there is no accountability for these sorts of abuses when it comes to actions by the Israeli authorities.
And what more can you tell us about the record of treatment of Palestinian journalists by Israeli security forces?
Look, I mean, we have a long record that dates back decades of Palestinian journalists being detained, arrested for their reporting. Human Rights Watch has documented on these incidents, and of course, Israeli forces regularly use excessive force and other means that go far beyond what international law authorizes in the way it polices demonstrations in the surrounding areas. And we've seen journalists shot at and killed, including, for example, Yasser Orteja in Gaza during the Gaza March of Return. And as noted, the UN investigated those events. The Commission of Inquiry formed to look into these events and made a clear point of noting that their conclusion was that Israeli forces fired at those journalists, knowing full well who they are.
What measures would you say can be taken, if any, to protect journalists better, particularly in this region?
Look, I think it's important that states, put pressure on the Israeli government. The reality here is that this is happening against the backdrop of systematic violence against Palestinians. The killing of, journalists, the arrest of journalists comes.
大家好，我是陈小芳。今年83岁已经做好第3剂 COVID-19 疫苗。拍疫苗进前，就爱食好饱、困好饱，确定讲家己身体状况确实真正常。中部都爱有厝的人或者照顾的人去陪伴伊哦。到拍疫苗所在吼，会有医生甲你评估，假使讲咱有啥物问题，嘛会用请教医生哦。 千万甲闭起来，拍完疫苗，特别现场的至少休困15分钟以上。感觉讲家己身体无爽快，就用转去厝休困啊。转去厝了后，爱特别注意家己身体状况，加休困，加啉水。假使讲若感觉身体无爽快，就参照阮呢发烧或超过48点钟的时阵，感觉讲呢喘气喘袂离，会晕会戆，心肝头泡菜，啊，佫有全身的起疹毛，咱着赶紧叫厝的人带来叫医生看啦。 我是陈小芳，请你甲我共款，手闭起来，来去注疫苗，提升保护力。